On the northern tip of Africa, on a strip of land Spain has held since the 16th century, a crisis has been unfolding this week that officials are calling the largest of its kind since 2021. The city is Ceuta, a Spanish enclave of roughly 80,000 people, wedged between the Mediterranean and the Moroccan coastline, separated from the rest of Spain by open water and from Morocco by little more than a fence. In the span of about 24 hours, Spain's Interior Ministry says close to 50,000 people crossed that fence, swam around it, or simply walked through breaches torn open in the barrier by the sheer weight of the crowd. To put that number in perspective, that is more than half the resident population of the entire city arriving in a single day. The scale of what happened is difficult to convey through numbers alone, so it's worth walking through how the week actually unfolded, because the story did not begin on the day the images went viral. For roughly the last 10 days, according to Ceuta's regional government, a slow trickle had already been building. Local officials reported between 1,500 and 2,000 irregular crossings in that period, itself an unusually high figure, but nothing that had triggered alarm on a European scale. Then, on Thursday, the trickle became a flood. Huge crowds began massing on the Moroccan side of the border, in and around the town of Fnidek. And by nightfall, thousands were pushing through the barrier at once, some going over land, many others going into the water and swimming around the breakwater fencing at Tarajal Beach, one of the most notorious crossing points in the enclave's history. Spanish state broadcaster RTVE aired footage of burned-out cars on the Moroccan side of the frontier, filmed after what were described as clashes near the border. Migrant rights advocates who spoke to International Wire Services described a scene that, by their account, closely echoed May of 2021, when a diplomatic rupture between Madrid and Rabat led Morocco to loosen its own border controls, and roughly 8,000 to 10,000 people crossed into Ceuta within just a couple of days. That earlier episode is still remembered in Spain as the benchmark for a full-blown border emergency. This week's numbers are several times larger. The human cost has been severe, and it has been reported with some inconsistency as the picture has developed hour by hour, which is itself telling of how chaotic the situation has been on the ground. Early reports out of Thursday night put the death toll at 18, most of the victims having drowned attempting to swim around the sea barrier, others killed in stampedes as crowds pressed against the breakwater fencing. By Friday, as more information came in from Spanish authorities and international outlets, that figure had been revised upward substantially, with several major news organizations now citing a toll in the high 50s, and some local sources putting it even higher. Regardless of which specific number eventually holds up as the final count, the pattern is consistent across every account. A significant number of people died in the water or in the crush of bodies trying to reach Spanish soil, and unaccompanied children were among those swept up in the chaos. Rachid Spihi, who heads a local association representing civil guard officers in Ceuta, described what he was seeing in blunt terms, calling it a serious humanitarian crisis. He told reporters that thousands of migrants, including children traveling without their families, were left sleeping in the city's parks and along its sidewalks, with no shelter and nowhere for the local reception system to put them. Others, he said, were simply wandering the streets without direction because the infrastructure that would normally receive and process new arrivals had been overwhelmed within hours. Ceuta's regional president, Juan Jesus Vivas, went further, declaring what he called an absolute humanitarian and social emergency, and appealing directly to the national government in Madrid to send troops to help reassert control over the city. Speaking to Spanish radio, he described a city whose social services and security forces had simply been swamped by days of arrivals running at several hundred people per day, even before Thursday's surge, and he tried to put the scale of the emergency in terms an ordinary Spanish listener could grasp, noting that, proportionally, an equivalent surge affecting the rest of the country would be a crisis on an entirely different order of magnitude. One detail that has drawn particular attention from analysts covering the story is just how thin Spain's on-the-ground security presence was when the surge began. According to Spanish newspaper El Mundo, only 55 agents were on the front line at the moment the crisis broke out, a fraction by the paper's own estimate of what would actually be required to manage a breach of this size. That gap between the resources deployed and the scale of what showed up at the border goes a long way toward explaining why so many people were able to cross so quickly, and why the response in the first hours looked, by several accounts, less like a controlled operation and more like a system simply being swept aside. There's also a striking detail in how some of the crossings actually played out. Video circulating from Thursday shows groups of migrants walking through the streets of Ceuta, not in flight from police, but past them, some calling out in apparent celebration, thanking Spanish officers as they walked by. Reporting from several outlets on the ground describes police and civil guard units doing comparatively little to physically intervene in those moments, with some officers instead trying to redirect the new arrivals toward the city's migrant reception center, rather than attempting to turn them back. That detail complicates a simple narrative of violent confrontation at every point of entry. The picture that emerges from multiple independently reported accounts is one of extraordinary numbers overwhelming a system that, in many individual moments, was not so much fighting back as struggling to even process what was happening. That is not to say there was no confrontation at all. Reports do describe clashes and the use of tear gas and water cannon by security forces at various points along the frontier as crowds pushed against barriers, and the burned vehicles shown on Moroccan television point to real unrest on that side of the line as well. But the picture painted by the most credible, corroborated reporting is one of a system overwhelmed by sheer numbers more than a running battle sustained across the whole city, and it's worth being careful about that distinction. Because in a story moving this fast, dramatic but unverified claims spread quickly on social media. And not everything shared online in the past 2 days is held up under scrutiny from major news organizations on the ground. By Friday, Spain's government said it had begun to regain the upper hand. The Interior Ministry reported that more than 48,000 of the roughly 50,000 people who had entered were already back on the Moroccan side, most of them, officials say, having returned voluntarily rather than through a formal deportation process. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez traveled to the enclave personally to oversee the response, a signal of just how seriously Madrid is treating the episode, and by several accounts, he was not greeted warmly by everyone on the ground, with some crowds reportedly shouting insults at him as he arrived, a reflection of just how raw the local mood has become after several days of strain on the city. Spain's government has also moved to reinforce the border itself, with additional military personnel and equipment being sent to Ceuta to shore up the barrier and support the civil guard. Legally, Spain's government has been careful in how it frames the episode. A national emergency declaration, of the kind that would trigger the country's most sweeping legal powers, does not formally apply here, because Spanish law does not classify a migration surge, on its own, as a risk to national security in that technical sense. Instead, officials have described what is underway as a coordinated response across multiple government agencies, working to move quickly and effectively to bring the situation back under control. The Moroccan side of this story matters just as much as the Spanish side, and it is worth pausing on because the diplomatic relationship between Madrid and Rabat has a long and difficult history with exactly this kind of episode. Morocco's ambassador to Spain, Karima Benyaich, addressed the crisis publicly and stated that the situation was not something her government wanted, distancing Rabat from any suggestion that the surge had been deliberately engineered or tolerated from the Moroccan side. That statement echoes the position Morocco took after the 2021 episode, when accusations flew in both directions about whether Rabat had intentionally loosened its own border controls as leverage in an unrelated diplomatic dispute over the Western Sahara region. That earlier crisis was only resolved in a diplomatic sense when Spain shifted its position to back Morocco's autonomy plan for the territory the following year, a reminder that these border surges have, in the recent past, been entangled with much larger geopolitical disputes, rather than being purely humanitarian or purely security stories. Spain's own government has offered a more specific explanation for why this particular surge happened now, and it is worth laying out because it adds a legal dimension that has been largely absent from the loudest social media commentary. According to statements from Spain's foreign ministry, the trigger was not, as some have suggested, connected to any broader regularization or amnesty policy for migrants already inside Spain. Instead, officials point to a recent ruling from Spain's Supreme Court concerning migrants intercepted at sea near Ceuta and Melilla, Spain's other North African enclave. That ruling determined that people intercepted while swimming toward Spanish territory cannot be summarily returned under the country's expedited procedure, the way land crossings often are. In practical terms, that means anyone who reaches Spanish waters by sea gains access to a formal legal process, with time for registration, legal representation, and consideration of an asylum claim, rather than an immediate turnaround. Spanish officials argue that this legal opening has been seized upon by smuggling networks and criminal organizations operating on the Moroccan side, who have used it as, in effect, a selling point to encourage and organize mass sea crossings, promising migrants a real chance at reaching Spanish soil and staying there long enough to be processed rather than turned back within hours. Whether or not that explanation accounts for the entire scale of what happened this week, it does offer a more precise legal and logistical account of the timing than a simple story of spontaneous mass migration, and it is the explanation Spain's government has repeatedly offered as pressure has mounted from other European capitals to explain what went wrong. And pressure from other European capitals has mounted very quickly. Within a day of the crisis breaking into international headlines, it had already become a live political flashpoint well beyond Spain's borders. And this is where the story shifts from a national emergency into a genuine European Union dispute. Italy moved first and moved hardest. Italy's Interior Ministry announced it was suspending the Schengen free movement arrangement with Spain, closing its air and sea borders to travelers arriving without passport checks. It is worth being precise about what this actually means. because the phrase suspending Schengen sounds more dramatic in shorthand than the mechanics behind it. Italy and Spain do not share a land border, so the practical effect falls on people traveling by plane or by boat between the two countries, who will now need to show a passport rather than travel freely as they would under normal Schengen rules. The Schengen framework itself explicitly allows member states to reintroduce temporary border checks on security or public order grounds, so Italy's move, while politically loaded, sits within the formal rules of the system rather than outside them. The announcement came from the top of Italy's government. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said the images coming out of Ceuta showed that uncontrolled illegal immigration poses a real threat to the security of Europe's borders, and stated plainly that her government would not yield an inch on the issue, framing it as a continuation of her administration's consistent position on migration since taking office in 2022. Her foreign minister, Antonio Tajani, went further still, saying he supported closing the Schengen area to Spain entirely and describing uncontrolled irregular immigration as a danger to national security. Italy's government also said it had coordinated with France to tighten controls along the French-Italian land border, aiming to prevent people from using Italy as a route further into Europe. Finland aligned itself with Rome almost immediately. Finland's Interior Minister, Mari Rantanen, posted publicly that every European country ought to support Meloni's proposal, arguing that any country failing to fulfill its obligation to protect the European Union's external border should not be entitled to remain inside the Schengen system. By Friday, according to reporting from Euronews, several other governments had moved toward that same position, including the Netherlands, Denmark, the Czech Republic, and Sweden, suggesting this was no longer a two-country dispute, but the beginning of a broader split within the bloc over how to treat a member state that finds itself at the receiving end of a sudden migration surge. Spain's response to Italy's move was sharp. Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares condemned Tajani's call for a Schengen suspension and summoned Italy's ambassador in Madrid to demand an explanation, a formal diplomatic step that signals real anger rather than routine disagreement. Spanish officials have pushed back specifically against the suggestion, implicit in Italy's framing, that this was a crisis of Spain's own making through lax migration policy, insisting instead on the Supreme Court ruling and criminal exploitation explanation described earlier. There has also been pointed criticism from Spain's side that Rome is using a genuine humanitarian emergency for domestic political advantage, rather than responding to it in good faith, a criticism echoed by some critics inside Italy itself. That domestic political backdrop in Italy is worth explaining, because it helps make sense of why the reaction from Rome has been so forceful and so fast. Meloni's coalition took power in 2022 on a platform that made reducing illegal immigration a central promise, and her government has faced growing pressure more recently from an even further right party led by a former army general, Roberto Vannacci, whose anti-migration rhetoric has been gaining traction with parts of the Italian electorate. Critics of Meloni's government, including voices on the Italian center-left, have described the Schengen suspension as largely symbolic, a gesture aimed at a domestic audience rather than a policy grounded in any evidence that migrants arriving in Ceuta had plans to continue onward into Italy specifically. Supporters of the move counter that Italy has, in fact, recorded more irregular border crossings than Spain across the period from 2021 to 2026, according to figures from the EU's border agency Frontex, and argue that a country in that position has standing to demand stronger, more consistent enforcement from every member state, not just a token response confined to Spain and Morocco. The reaction has not stopped at Italy and Finland. France's Interior Minister announced that instructions had already gone out to immediately step up checks along France's own border, with the country's Rapid Border Intervention Force being mobilized to carry out thorough inspections, a step taken independently of Italy's formal Schengen suspension, but clearly motivated by the same underlying anxiety about onward movement across the continent. And the story has traveled even further than Europe. Reporting indicates that officials within the current United States administration referenced footage from Ceuta this week as part of broader arguments about immigration enforcement, illustrating how a border crisis in a small North African enclave can be folded almost instantly into political arguments happening on entirely different continents. Stepping back from the individual statements and diplomatic maneuvers, it's worth thinking about what this episode reveals about the underlying tensions inside the European Union's approach to migration, because those tensions did not appear this week. They have simply been exposed by it. The Schengen system was built around a basic bargain. Member states surrender routine internal border checks in exchange for a shared, effectively managed external border. When a crisis like this hits one member state's external frontier, in this case, Spain's land border with Morocco at Ceuta, it tests that bargain directly, because every other member state is, in effect, being asked to trust that Spain's border is also being handled as if it were their own. Italy and its allies in this dispute are essentially arguing that trust has been broken, or at least strained past the point where it can be assumed automatically. Spain's position is that a single, sudden, extraordinary surge, triggered by a specific and narrow legal ruling being exploited by organized smugglers, is not evidence of a systemic failure to manage its border, and that treating it as grounds for suspending free movement is a disproportionate and politically motivated response. There is a legitimate argument on each side of that divide, and it is not really a question this script can resolve, because it is, at its core, a dispute about values and priorities as much as it is a dispute about facts. Those who favor a harder line, like Maloney's and Tajani's governments, point to the reality that 50,000 people entering a city of 80,000 within a single day is, by any reasonable definition, a loss of control at that specific border point, regardless of what legal mechanism triggered it, and they argue that European citizens have a right to expect their union's external frontier to hold. Those who favor Spain's more measured framing point out that suspending an entire country's participation in Schengen over a localized, days-long episode risks treating an emergency, however serious, as a permanent judgment on that country's competence or good faith, and that doing so mid-crisis, before the situation has even fully stabilized, looks less like careful policy and more like capitalizing on someone else's disaster for political gain at home. Humanitarian organizations and migrant advocates, for their part, have tended to focus on a different set of facts entirely. The scale of the death toll, the presence of unaccompanied children among those crossing, and the conditions people were left in once they arrived, sleeping outdoors in a city whose reception systems were instantly overwhelmed. From that vantage point, the story of the past 2 days is less about border security policy and more about a group of desperate people, many of them very young, taking extraordinary physical risks, dozens of whom did not survive the attempt, and a receiving system on the European side that was not remotely prepared to absorb what showed up. All of these framings are, in a sense, simultaneously true, which is part of why this story has generated such intense and divided reactions so quickly. It is a humanitarian emergency, with a serious human cost measured in dozens of confirmed deaths and thousands of people, including children, left without adequate shelter for at least part of this week. It is a test of Spain's border security and legal framework, exposed in real time by a court ruling whose downstream consequences were apparently not fully anticipated. It is a diplomatic episode between Madrid and Rabat, following a well-worn pattern from 2021 in which cross-border migration flows have been entangled with unrelated geopolitical disputes. And it is now a genuine crisis of confidence within the European Union's Schengen system, with a growing bloc of member states signaling that they are prepared to unilaterally reintroduce border controls against a fellow member state rather than wait for a coordinated EU-wide response. As of the most recent reporting, the immediate emergency in Ceuta itself appears to be easing. The great majority of those who crossed earlier in the week, upward of 48,000 people by Spain's own count, have already returned to Morocco, largely without a formal deportation process being required, suggesting that many who crossed did not necessarily intend or expect to remain permanently, or realized quickly that conditions on the Spanish side offered no clear path forward. Spanish security forces, reinforced by additional military personnel, appear to be reasserting physical control over the border itself, but the diplomatic and political fallout shows no sign of resolving nearly as quickly. Italy's Schengen suspension with Spain remains in place. The coalition of countries aligning behind Rome's position appears to be growing rather than shrinking, and Spain's government continues to reject the underlying premise that this week's events reflect any failure of its own migration policy. What happens next will likely depend on several things playing out over the coming days and weeks rather than hours. Whether Spain moves to address the specific legal gap created by its Supreme Court's ruling on sea interceptions, whether Morocco takes visible steps to tighten its own side of the border in a way that reassures Madrid's European partners, and whether the current alignment of Italy, Finland, and several other governments hardens into a sustained push for EU-level reform of how Schengen handles exactly this kind of localized but severe border emergency, or instead fades as a largely symbolic and temporary measure once the immediate images from Ceuta stop dominating headlines. For now, the enclave itself is left absorbing both the physical aftermath of an extraordinary week and the opening moves of a political argument about European borders that is very unlikely to end where it started. To understand why a single city of 80,000 people can generate a continent-wide political rupture within 48 hours, it helps to understand what Ceuta actually is, geographically and politically, because its position is genuinely unusual and has been a source of friction for centuries, long before modern migration politics existed. Ceuta sits on a narrow isthmus on the North African coast, directly across the Strait of Gibraltar from mainland Spain, and Spain has held it continuously since 1580, making it one of the oldest European territorial footholds on the African continent. Along with Melilla, another small Spanish city further along the Moroccan coast, Ceuta represents something structurally unique inside the European Union, the only land border the entire bloc shares with the African continent. Every other EU external frontier facing Africa is a sea border, patrolled by coast guards and naval vessels across open water. Ceuta and Melilla are different. Someone standing on the Moroccan side of the fence in Fenidek is standing in a very literal sense at the edge of the European Union itself, with nothing but a barrier between them and Spanish, and therefore EU territory. That geography is precisely why these two small cities have functioned for decades as a kind of pressure valve and flashpoint simultaneously. Because the crossing distance is so short compared with the sea journeys migrants attempt elsewhere in the Mediterranean, Ceuta and Melilla have repeatedly seen surges of exactly this kind. Mass rushes at the fence line whenever conditions align. Political tension between Madrid and Rabat, a change in enforcement posture on the Moroccan side, a court ruling like the one described earlier that alters the incentives at the margin, or simply a buildup of people in nearby Moroccan towns who have been gathering for weeks in the hope of a moment exactly like the one that arrived this past Thursday. Spain has responded to this recurring vulnerability over the years by building some of the most heavily fortified border infrastructure anywhere in Europe, multiple rows of fencing topped with anti-climbing mesh, motion sensors, and infrared cameras. That this infrastructure was nonetheless overrun so quickly and so completely this week is itself part of what has alarmed other European capitals. Because if fortifications of that scale can be breached at this scale, the implicit question becomes what exactly would be required to prevent a recurrence. It's also worth placing this week's numbers in the context of Spain's broader migration picture over the past several years, because the story did not emerge out of nowhere. Spain has seen a steady rise in irregular arrivals across multiple routes in recent years, not only at Ceuta and Melilla, but also via the far more dangerous and much longer sea crossing to the Canary Islands, a journey that has claimed thousands of lives over the past decade and has, at various points, drawn its own share of European attention and criticism. Compared with the Canary Islands route, arrivals at Ceuta and Melilla have historically been smaller in absolute numbers, but far more visually dramatic, precisely because they happen in a compressed visible rush at a single narrow physical point, rather than being spread across open ocean over days or weeks. That visual drama is part of why episodes like this one generate outsized political reaction relative to their scale. A sea crossing that claims lives over the course of a slow, largely invisible voyage rarely produces the kind of footage that a mass fence rush does, footage of thousands of people visibly moving in real time across a hard line on a map. The media dimension of this story deserves its own attention because the way this crisis has been covered, and in some cases miscovered, has itself become part of the story. As with almost any fast-moving, visually dramatic border event in the current media environment, a great deal of footage and commentary spread across social platforms well before it could be independently verified by professional news organizations. Some of that material has held up under scrutiny from established outlets like the Associated Press, Reuters, and major European broadcasters. Footage of crowds crossing at Tarajal, of burned vehicles on the Moroccan side, of water cannon being deployed. Other claims that circulated widely in the first day of the crisis, including some more extreme accounts of destruction and disorder inside the city itself, have not been independently corroborated by the same tier of established reporting. And in a story with this much political weight attached to it, from multiple directions at once, it is worth treating the less corroborated claims with real caution, rather than repeating them as settled fact simply because they were widely shared. This is not a story where anyone benefits from exaggeration in either direction. Not the people still trying to reach Europe, not the residents of Ceuta trying to get their city back to normal, and not the policymakers who will actually have to design whatever comes next. There's also an economic and social dimension to this crisis that tends to get less attention than the diplomatic headlines, but matters enormously to the people actually living through it. Ceuta is a small, geographically isolated city with a local economy built substantially around its port, its status as a free trade zone and cross-border commerce with Morocco. A crisis of this scale disrupts all of that almost immediately. Local businesses, schools, and public services are not designed to absorb a population surge equivalent to well over half the city's residents in a single day, even temporarily. Hotel capacity, emergency shelter space, food supplies, medical services, and policing resources that are calibrated for a city of 80,000 people simply do not scale instantly to meet a sudden second population arriving overnight, which is precisely why local officials describe the situation in terms of total system overwhelm, rather than a manageable, if serious, security incident. Ceuta's residents, many of whom have lived through smaller versions of this exact scenario before, are left dealing with the practical aftermath long after the international news cycle moves on to the diplomatic dispute in Brussels and Rome. Looking at the European Union's institutional response so far, It is notable that, as of this point in the crisis, the reaction has been driven almost entirely by individual member states acting unilaterally rather than by any coordinated response from Brussels itself. Italy acted on its own authority under the exceptions built into the Schengen framework. Finland, the Netherlands, Denmark, the Czech Republic, and Sweden aligned themselves politically with Italy's position without necessarily taking equivalent formal action of their own. France tightened its own checks independently. The European Commission, which is nominally responsible for coordinating exactly this kind of cross-border migration emergency under the bloc's newer migration and asylum pact, has so far played a comparatively quiet role in the public narrative of this crisis compared with the loud, competing statements coming out of national capitals. That pattern, a genuinely EU-wide flashpoint being managed primarily through a scramble of individual national responses rather than a unified bloc-level plan, is itself a recurring criticism that has been leveled at the EU's migration architecture for years, through the 2015 migration crisis, through repeated smaller flashpoints at various external borders since, and now again this week at Ceuta. Critics of the current EU migration and asylum pact, adopted in recent years specifically to try to prevent this kind of uncoordinated scramble, will likely point to this episode as evidence that the pact's mechanisms for burden sharing and rapid joint response have not yet proven themselves under real pressure. Defenders of the pact may argue it is simply too early, and this crisis too localized and too fast-moving, for its slower, more deliberative mechanisms to have had a chance to activate at all. Whichever interpretation eventually wins out in the policy debate that follows, the events of the past 2 days in Ceuta have already accomplished something that months of ordinary political argument in Brussels had not. They have forced open, in public and in real time, the exact fault lines that run underneath Europe's entire approach to migration and border management. Those fault lines are not new. They are the same ones that have surfaced repeatedly since 2015, and in smaller form at Ceuta itself in 2021, a tension between solidarity among member states and each country's insistence on controlling its own borders, a tension between humanitarian obligation and public anxiety over uncontrolled arrivals, and a tension between the EU's founding promise of free movement inside its borders, and the reality that a union is only as secure at its edges as its most exposed member state's weakest point of entry. Ceuta, this week, was that weakest point. What Europe does next in Brussels, in Rome, in Helsinki, and above all in Madrid and Rabat will be one more data point in a debate about borders, sovereignty, and shared responsibility that Europe has still not fully resolved, and that this single overwhelmed city on the African coast has once again forced back to the top of the continent's agenda.